Spain is just a few days away from joining the small number of countries that are capable of carrying out a space launch. We're talking about the launch of a rocket manufactured in Spain and also launched from the Iberian Peninsula. PLD Space is planning to launch its Miura 1 rocket, and this is just the first step for the company that could become the European SpaceX. Space development began at the end of World War II, since the Germans had developed the first rocket in history. The United States and the Soviet Union put all their budgets into showing who had better space technology. But at that time, all that budget came from the government, since it was a matter of national security. After reaching the moon, heavy investment was no longer necessary. And that's why, even though the space shuttle was developed by the United States, public interest disappeared. After this milestone, justifying the huge expense was impossible. This is clearly seen in the graph of National Aeronautics and Space Administration's annual budget as a percentage of government spending. It exceeded 4% for over a year, plus there was the interest issue. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was costing the United States millions, leading to cuts in space research to fund the war. Everything continued that way until Elon Musk founded SpaceX in 2002, a private company aiming for economic sustainability. This means that by putting satellites into orbit for companies or governments, they would be able to finance the development of different rockets. Clearly today we know that they are achieving it, but back then this was truly crazy. From 2011 when the space shuttle retired to 2020 when SpaceX tested its Dragon capsule with astronauts in orbit. The United States had to buy seats on the Russian Soyuz capsules to send its astronauts. In fact, during that period, it was the only way to put astronauts into orbit. While it's true that SpaceX received public funding in its early days and had the support of Elon Musk's money, it has now proven that its economic model is more than sustainable. And that's very good news. Following its example, Spain's PLD Space was founded in 2011 by two aerospace engineers. Similar to Elon Musk's idea, launching satellites into orbit. Although this may seem like a crazy idea, the reality is that hundreds of companies need or will need satellite information. In addition, it will also be possible to collaborate with governments, something that SpaceX Europe does. Until now, all space missions were carried out through the European Space Agency. This has allowed the integration of all the member countries under a common cause. However, this means the agency does not prioritize each country's specific interests. And that's why now it seems that the European countries individually are quite far behind other countries, such as for example China, Russia, India, or Japan. Let's be honest, any country aiming for international relevance needs a presence in space, mainly through satellites rather than astronauts. And that's why the European countries have realized that they need their own program. Currently in Europe, we have three leading countries: the United Kingdom with Virgin Orbit, Germany with Impulse, and Spain with PLD Space. The latter are clearly the ones we're going to talk about today. Because if everything goes well, PLD Space will be able to make its first space launch in a matter of days. The rocket is the Miura 1 stage with suborbital flight capability. That means it won't be able to put a payload into orbit, but it will allow for a few seconds in zero gravity. It stands 12.5 meters tall with a 0.7 meter diameter. The launch mass will be 2,550 kilograms, and the payload it can carry will be 100 kilograms. That is 4% of the total mass of the spacecraft. That's pretty normal within rocket parameters, as we already analyzed in this video you have in the corner. They can carry less cargo to travel farther, or vice versa. This would make the rocket spend more or less time in microgravity. These are the trajectory differences based on the mass they want to launch. The aircraft has a single engine, which is why it's called Miura 1. The engine is called Spanish Technology for Reusable Space Propulsion for Launchers, which stands for Spanish Technology for Reusable Space Propulsion for Launchers, and it uses a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen for combustion. In the end, rockets are characterized by carrying both the fuel and the oxidizer within their own structure to perform combustion. Airplanes flying high in the atmosphere use surrounding oxygen as an oxidizer to generate a spark and start combustion. The problem is that rockets leave the atmosphere and therefore cannot make use of the air in the atmosphere. And that's why they need to carry both the fuel and the oxidizer within their own structure. Additionally, this rocket has vector thrust, which means it can slightly redirect the exhaust to generate torque. This lets it steer the rocket's nose, and it also has fins for this purpose. Well, this mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen was one of the first combinations used for rocket engines. Precisely because it's cheap and not very dangerous, all things considered. These engines, which use kerosene and liquid oxygen, are usually called kerolox, but the problem with kerolox is that it's cryogenic. This means it has to be stored at extremely low temperatures to keep it in a liquid state. This makes it unsuitable for military use. But it could be a good idea for a company like PLD Space, which currently has its facilities in Elche in the southeast of Spain. It also has an agreement with Teruel Airport for engine tests, and has already done several static firings. Looking at this photo from PLD Space, you can see where engine tests take place. Meanwhile, this is the platform used to perform a vertical ignition with the rocket before launch. So, the rocket engine test bench is used to perform engine tests, to develop new things or implement improvements. And the vertical test stunt is the step before launch to verify that everything is working properly. The launch will take place from Huelva in the south of Spain from the National Institute for Aerospace Technology facilities, where they have already been working for months to install the launch platform. This is a good place because the weather conditions are almost always favorable for the launch. Also, thanks to the collaboration with National Institute for Aerospace Technology, they have the monitoring facilities at their disposal as well. The launch platform has a horizontal arm to which the rocket will be attached. Afterward, it will be raised and release the rocket at launch for ascent. What about the rocket's braking? Re-entry uses a parachute, which has already been tested in real life, by asking the army to use one of their Chinooks to drop the rocket from about 5-kilometer altitude and see how the parachute deployment system worked. Fortunately, everything went well, and this is because they intend to reuse the rocket. While it's true that the Miura 1 can be contracted by companies to carry out some kind of experiment in microgravity, Chief Executive Officer Raul Torres has acknowledged that the main goal of this rocket is to test the developed technology, so that if something fails or doesn't go as planned, they can change it before developing the Miura 5, their real rocket. To date, PLD Space's funding has reached up to 50 million euros, but they have said that to develop the Miura 5, they will need to reach 70. Although if the launch scheduled in the next few days is successful, there will surely be no problem reaching the funding. So far, it is estimated to be around 70% private funding and 30% public funding. Private funding mainly comes from companies that trust the project and invest to launch with them later. Europe's funding system differs from the United States, where it's easier to get public funding early in a project to advance it. Once things work well, private investment follows. In Europe, it's the opposite. Public aid requires the project to already have a solid foundation. To have reached that point, you would have needed private investment, which is very hard to get if your project is still just starting out. But it seems that the time has come when PLD Space already has the trust of government entities. Gradually, it's turning into a leviathan that's difficult to stop. The current plan is to launch the Miura 1 from Huelva, but for safety reasons it has to be launched in the opposite direction of the Earth's rotation. This doesn't matter for suborbital flights, so the Miura 1 can launch from the Iberian Peninsula without issue. However, launching against Earth's rotation is too disadvantageous to make sense for putting a payload into orbit. It's estimated that around 30% efficiency is lost. Besides, this way, your satellite will orbit in the opposite direction to the rest of the satellites. Plus, the company using PLD Space's services might not want that. It's a problem because you could crash into all the satellites that are orbiting in the opposite direction, which are literally thousands. Because it's been established that the Miura 5 will launch from French Guiana, which is where all the European Space Agency launches take place. It's a site quite close to the equator, which allows you to make the most of the Earth's initial rotational speed. PLD Space aims to build a fully Spanish industry, so they won't rely on allies to launch into orbit. And everything has been respected up until the moment of launch, where suddenly European approval is needed to launch from Guyana. And this makes everything before that pointless. The option that PLD has provided is to take advantage of the Canary Islands, a place far from the coast of Africa, to launch in the direction of the Earth's rotation. This would actually give Spain independence from any other country to launch. Furthermore, the Canary Islands could become a sort of space headquarters, since National Institute for Aerospace Technology also has its facilities on the island of Gran Canaria. But apparently, for some reason, this idea hasn't been well received. And finally, let's take a quick look at what we can expect to see at the launch of Miura. T minus 2 seconds, the engines ignite so that at T0, the rocket generates enough thrust to lift off. The launch platform will detach and the rocket will ascend. At T minus 15 seconds and 0.5 kilometers altitude, the rocket's nose would start turning to one side. At T minus 122 seconds, the engine shuts down to gain tangential velocity. This is called main engine cutoff. At T minus 127 seconds, the rocket begins to align with the trajectory so that microgravity can begin. At T minus 127 at minus 145 seconds and T minus 270 seconds, the rocket will reach apogee, and then at T minus 396, microgravity will end. Lasting a total of 251 seconds, that is, more than 4 minutes in total. At T minus 523 seconds, the parachutes will deploy, and at T minus 750, it will reach the sea surface. The entire process takes 12-13 minutes. Remember, starting this type of company is very expensive due to high initial costs. Infrastructure, machines to manufacture the rockets, facilities to store them, and so on. After the initial investment, making more rockets isn't very costly. That's why actually, after this first launch, PLD space will be in a very positive position. Follow me on my social media where I'll post the exact time and day of the launch. Thank you very much for watching this video and leave your opinion about this company in the comments.